Daniel Whitfield felt the eyes on him before he even sat down. 12 species, 12 sets of unfamiliar faces, all turned toward the small human delegation as they entered the circular chamber aboard the station called Threnodi's Reach. The air smelled faintly of ozone, and something sweet he could not place. He did not smile. He did not look away. He simply walked to his seat, placed his hands flat on the table, and waited. Beside him, Laura Bennett kept her expression calm, though her fingers pressed just a little too hard against the edge of her tablet. She had spent 6 months preparing for this meeting, memorizing customs, greetings, and the strange rules of politeness that governed every species in this room. None of it had prepared her for the way the air itself seemed to hum with expectation, as if the entire station were holding its breath. Colonel Grant Ashford sat at the far end, arms crossed, his eyes moving from delegate to delegate, with the quiet focus of a man cataloging exits. He was not there to speak, he was there to watch, and what he saw troubled him more than he let on. Every alien delegate in that room carried themselves with the ease of creatures who had done this 1,000 times before. Humanity had done it exactly once. The senior arbiter of the Galactic Concord, a tall being named Vex the Khal, rose first. His skin shimmered faintly under the chamber lights, shifting from silver to pale blue as he spoke. His voice was smooth, almost musical, and carried easily across the room without need for amplification. "Welcome," he said, "to the first formal peace talks between the Concord and the species known as humanity. We meet today not as strangers, but as neighbors seeking understanding." Daniel inclined his head slightly. He did not trust the warmth in the arbiter's voice. He had read the briefings. He had studied the history of these talks, the way other young species had been welcomed with similar words, only to leave the table smaller than they had entered it. Humanity was the newest arrival to a galaxy that had been trading, fighting, and negotiating for longer than recorded human history. That fact alone made every word spoken here worth weighing twice. "We appreciate the invitation," Daniel said. His voice was even, unhurried. "Humanity is ready to discuss the future of our borders, our trade, and our place among the Concord's members." A ripple of soft sound moved through the chamber, something between a murmur and a sigh. Several delegates exchanged glances. Vex the Khal's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, just for a moment, before smoothing away again. "Then let us begin," the arbiter said. For the first hour, the talks moved the way Laura had expected. Trade routes were discussed. Communication protocols were proposed. A delegate from a species with 4 arms and a voice like rolling thunder spoke at length about mineral rights near a system humanity had only recently mapped. Daniel listened to all of it without interruption, letting Laura take notes, letting Grant watch the room, keeping his own attention fixed on the patterns beneath the words. He noticed it first in the way the delegates avoided a certain star system on the projected map. Every time the discussion drifted near the 3 border systems humanity had claimed 18 months earlier, someone would smoothly redirect the conversation. A joke. A question about an unrelated trade dispute. A polite request to revisit the topic later. It happened 3 times before lunch. Daniel said nothing, but he began to count. During the recess, the human delegation gathered in a small private room set aside for them. The walls were a dull gray, the furniture unfamiliar in its proportions, built for bodies that were not quite human, but close enough to be uncomfortable. Laura closed the door behind them and exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. "They keep avoiding the border systems," she said. "Every time it comes up, someone changes the subject." "I noticed," Daniel said. Grant leaned against the wall, arms still crossed. "They're building toward something. This whole first day has been soft questions and easy answers. They're measuring us." "Of course they are," Daniel said. "We're the newest species most of them have ever negotiated with. They don't know what we want yet. They don't know what we'll accept." "Do we know what we'll accept?" Laura asked quietly. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. It was a fair question, and one he did not have a simple answer for. Humanity had entered these talks with clear boundaries set by its governing council, but boundaries on paper were different from boundaries tested in a room full of beings who had negotiated for centuries longer than humans had existed as a spacefaring people. "We know what we won't accept," he said finally. "That will have to be enough for now." The afternoon session began with a different tone. A delegate humanity had not yet heard from. A quiet, narrow being called Sarath-Ol stood and addressed the chamber. Its voice was soft, almost gentle, but every word landed with precision. The Concord recognizes humanity's recent claim to 3 systems along the outer boundary, Sarath-Ol said. We understand these systems hold significant value to your people. However, precedent within the Concord suggests that newly arrived species often benefit from a period of shared stewardship over contested territory, rather than unilateral claim. Daniel felt Laura go still beside him. Grant's arms uncrossed slowly, his hands settling flat against his knees, a habit Daniel recognized from years of working alongside him. It meant he was ready to move if he needed to. Shared stewardship, Daniel repeated. Meaning? Meaning, Vex the Call said, stepping smoothly into the conversation, that the Concord would oversee administration of the 3 systems for a probationary period, allowing humanity to demonstrate its readiness for full membership among established species. This is not a punishment, it is simply how things have been done, for every species that has come before you. The chamber fell quiet. Every alien eye in the room turned toward the human delegation, waiting. Daniel kept his face still. Inside, something cold and clear settled over him, the same feeling he remembered from the moment humanity first detected an alien signal decades ago, a mixture of awe and caution that had never quite gone away. He thought of the people back home who had sent him here, the families living on those 3 systems, the years of work that had gone into settling worlds no one else had wanted, until humanity proved they were worth wanting. I understand this is how things have been done before, Daniel said slowly. But humanity did not come here today to be measured against a precedent set by other species' history. We came to discuss our future as equals. Vex the Call's smile remained fixed in place, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Equality, he said, is earned over time, Ambassador Whitfield. Every species in this chamber once sat where you sit now. Then perhaps, Daniel said, it is time the Concord considered that not every species needs the same amount of time to prove itself. A low murmur spread through the chamber again, louder this time. Laura kept her eyes on her tablet, though she was no longer typing. Grant's gaze swept the room once more, cataloging exits, distances, the positions of every guard stationed along the chamber's outer wall. Sarath-Ol tilted its narrow head slightly. You speak with confidence for a species so young. We speak with confidence, Daniel said, because we know exactly what we are willing to give up in these talks, and exactly what we are not. The Arbiter raised a hand, a gesture that seemed to call for calm, though nothing about his posture suggested calm at all. Let us not allow the first day to end in disagreement. We will reconvene tomorrow to discuss the matter further, with fresh minds and open hearts. Daniel nodded once, though the gesture felt hollow even as he made it. He understood, in that moment, that tomorrow's session would not be a discussion. It would be a test, carefully designed to see how far humanity could be pushed before it either yielded or broke. As the chamber began to empty, delegates rising and drifting toward the wide doors in small clusters, Daniel remained seated a moment longer than necessary. He watched the way the other species moved together, some in practiced formations, others in loose groups that still somehow communicated familiarity. Decades or centuries of shared history, condensed into the simple act of walking out of a room. Humanity had no such history here. They had only each other, and the weight of every decision they were about to make. That night, in the small human quarters carved into the station's outer ring, Daniel stood at the narrow viewport and looked out at the stars scattered beyond the station's hull. Somewhere among those points of light were the 3 systems the Concord wanted to place under its care. Somewhere among them were people who had built homes, raised children, and planted the first crops in soil no human had touched before. Laura joined him quietly, standing a respectful distance away. You're not going to sleep, are you? Not yet, he said. They're going to push harder tomorrow. I know. Are we ready for that? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the slow drift of a distant ship crossing the starfield outside. We're about to find out, he said. Behind them, Grant stood near the door, silent, his eyes fixed on the same stars, thinking of the systems, the people, and the quiet certainty settling in his chest. that tomorrow would decide far more than anyone in that chamber yet understood. The second day began exactly as Grant had predicted. No greetings, no warmth. Just 12 delegates already seated when the human party arrived, their expressions unreadable, their patience visibly thinner than it had been the day before. Vex the Call did not stand this time. He remained seated, his fingers laced together on the table before him, and gestured for the humans to take their places. "Let us continue," he said, "where we left off." Daniel sat. Laura sat beside him, tablet ready, though her eyes kept drifting to the projected star map still hovering above the center of the chamber, the 3 contested systems marked in soft amber light. Grant took his usual position, watching, always watching. "The Concord has discussed your position overnight," Sarathol said, its narrow head tilting toward the humans. "We understand your desire for full sovereignty over your claimed territory. However, we must also consider the stability of the wider region. Precedent exists for a reason. Precedent, Daniel said, was set by species who agreed to it. We have not. You have not yet had the opportunity to understand why such precedent exists," Vex the Call replied smoothly. "Allow me to explain. 3 centuries ago, a young species called the Ordini claimed sovereignty over a cluster of systems much like your own, without consulting the wider Concord. Conflict followed. Lives were lost, on both sides of that dispute. The precedent of shared stewardship was created to prevent such tragedies from repeating." Daniel listened carefully, aware that every word was chosen to make refusal seem reckless, even dangerous. It was a skillful argument, wrapped in concern for humanity's own safety. He recognized the shape of it immediately, the same shape used by negotiators throughout human history to convince the weaker party that giving something up was really a kind of protection. "We appreciate the history lesson," Daniel said carefully, "but humanity did not claim empty systems by force. We settled worlds that no other species had shown interest in for decades, perhaps longer. We built there. We did not take anything from anyone. And yet," Sarathol said, "the systems now sit along a boundary the Concord considers strategically significant. Their location alone gives them value beyond what your settlements represent." Laura's fingers paused over her tablet. She glanced at Daniel, and he caught the flicker of understanding pass between them, without a word spoken. This was never about precedent, or safety, or the memory of some long-ago conflict. It was about position. The Concord wanted those systems not because humanity had done anything wrong, but because the location was useful, and humanity was new enough, small enough, that the Concord believed it could simply take what it wanted through patient pressure, instead of open demand. "Let me be certain I understand," Daniel said slowly. "The Concord is asking humanity to give up sovereignty over 3 inhabited systems, not because we have broken any agreement, and not because those systems threaten anyone, but because their position on a map is convenient for the Concord's own purposes." The chamber went very quiet. Vex the Call's expression did not change, but something in his posture stiffened, just slightly. "That is a simplified reading of a complex situation, Ambassador. Is it inaccurate?" Daniel asked. No one answered immediately. Around the table, several delegates shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that Daniel could not fully interpret, though he recognized discomfort when he saw it, regardless of the shape of the face wearing it. Finally, a new voice spoke, one that had remained silent through most of the previous day, a delegate near the far end of the table, a being with deep violet skin and eyes like polished stone, leaned forward slightly. "The human ambassador is not wrong," the delegate said. "The systems in question sit along a route the Concord has long wished to secure. I see no reason to disguise that fact any further." Vex the Call's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ambassador Kessa, your candor is noted, though perhaps premature." "Perhaps," Ikessa said. "It is simply honest." Daniel felt something shift in the room, a small crack in the smooth surface of Concord unity, though he could not yet tell whether it would widen or close again before the day was through. He filed the moment away, along with the delegate's name, and returned his attention to the arbiter. "Then let us speak honestly," Daniel said. "The Concord wants those systems for strategic reasons. Humanity is not willing to surrender sovereignty over inhabited worlds, simply because their position is convenient for someone else's plans. That is not stability. That is a taking, dressed in careful language. "You misunderstand our intentions," FeetHFY said, his voice cooling further. "This is not a demand. It is a proposal, offered in the spirit of cooperation, that would allow humanity to demonstrate good faith, while the Concord ensures regional stability during your species' early years among us." "And if humanity declines this proposal?" Daniel asked. The Arbiter's silver-blue skin shifted, a ripple of color that Daniel had come to associate, over the course of 2 days, with something like irritation carefully restrained. "Then humanity would be choosing to enter this community as an outlier, rather than a partner. Such a choice carries consequences, Ambassador. Trade agreements, defense cooperation, access to resources many species freely share among themselves. All of these depend on trust, and trust is built through cooperation, not defiance." There it was, Daniel thought, the true shape of the offer, finally visible beneath its polite wrapping. Give up the systems, or be quietly excluded from everything else that mattered. Not a threat of open conflict, not yet, but something colder, and perhaps more effective. The threat of isolation in a galaxy humanity had only just begun to understand. He glanced at Laura, whose expression remained carefully neutral, though he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. He glanced at Grant, whose eyes had not left FeetHFY since the Arbiter began speaking. Then he looked back at the table, at the amber light, marking 3 small systems on a map, built by species, who had never once asked what those systems meant to the people living there. "I will need to discuss this with my delegation," Daniel said. "Privately." "Of course," FeetHFY said, some warmth returning to his voice now that he believed the pressure was working. "Take whatever time you require. We understand this is a significant decision." The human delegation withdrew to their private chamber once more. The moment the door closed, Grant spoke first, his voice low and controlled. "They just told us, in the most polite language I've ever heard, that if we don't give up those systems, they'll cut us off from everything else." "I heard it too," Daniel said. "That delegate, Kessa," Laura said. She broke ranks. "Why would she do that?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But it tells us something important. The Concord isn't as unified on this as they want us to believe." Grant crossed his arms, pacing a slow line across the small room. "Doesn't matter if they're unified or not. What matters is what we do next. If we walk away from this table, we lose access to everything they just threatened to withhold. If we agree, we lose the systems, and probably a lot more down the line, because once you show a room like that, you'll bend once. They'll expect you to bend again." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, thinking not of the chamber they had just left, but of the briefings he had studied for months before arriving at Threnity's Reach, the careful notes compiled by humanity's own historians about every recorded first contact negotiation between the Concord and a new species. In every single case, the pattern had been the same: small concessions, offered as reasonable, that grew larger over time, until the new species found itself with far less than it had started with. "There's a third option," Daniel said finally. Laura looked up. "What option?" "We don't agree," Daniel said. "And we don't argue. We simply tell them we need more time to consider, and then we leave." Grant stopped pacing. "Leave the table." "Leave the table," Daniel confirmed. "No demands, no threats. We just stop participating in a conversation that was never going to end fairly." "They'll see that as an insult," Laura said. "Maybe worse, an act of aggression even." "They might," Daniel said, "or they might not know what to make of it at all. Every species that's ever sat in that chamber has either agreed to the Concord's terms eventually, or fought back openly when pushed too far. We would be doing neither." Grant considered this for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're betting that uncertainty scares them more than defiance would." "I'm betting," Daniel said, "that a species used to predictable outcomes doesn't know what to do when the outcome simply stops arriving." The three of them sat with the idea for a long moment, the weight of it settling over the small room like a held breath. Laura finally broke the silence. "If we're doing this," she said, "we do it exactly right. No anger, no hesitation. We stand, we speak plainly, and we leave. Nothing more." Daniel nodded slowly, a decision forming behind his eyes, one that would, though none of them could yet know it, echo far beyond the walls of that small gray room and reshape the way an entire galaxy understood the newest species to join its long and complicated history. "Then let's go back in," he said, "and finish this." They returned to the chamber a few minutes later. The delegates were waiting, most of them settled into the same careful, patient expressions they had worn throughout the talks. Expressions built from centuries of practice negotiating with species far more predictable than the one now walking back through their doors. Vex the Call rose slightly as they entered, an almost hopeful shift in his posture. "Have you reached a decision, Ambassador Whitfield?" Daniel stood at his place at the table, Laura and Grant beside him, and let the silence stretch just long enough for every eye in the chamber to fix upon him. "We have," he said. "Humanity thanks the Concord for its hospitality these past 2 days," Daniel said, his voice steady and clear. "We have listened carefully to everything offered at this table. We understand the history behind the precedent you have described, and we understand the consequences you believe would follow our refusal to accept it." Vex the Call leaned forward slightly, waiting. "We will not be surrendering sovereignty over our systems," Daniel continued. "Not today, and not under the terms currently offered. Humanity needs time to consider its next steps, and that consideration will not take place at this table." For a moment, no one in the chamber moved. Then Daniel gathered the small stack of notes in front of him, tucked them beneath his arm, and stepped back from his chair. Laura rose beside him, closing her tablet with a quiet click that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the room. Grant stood last, his eyes sweeping the chamber one final time before he turned toward the door. "Ambassador," Vex the Call said, a note of genuine surprise breaking through his careful composure. "You understand what you are choosing to walk away from." "We understand exactly what we are choosing," Daniel said. "Thank you for your time." The three of them walked out of the chamber together, their footsteps the only sound echoing off the curved walls of Threnodi's Reach. Behind them, the doors closed with a soft mechanical hiss, sealing away 12 delegates who sat in stunned silence, none of them quite certain what had just happened, or what it meant. News of the walkout reached the wider Concord within hours, spreading through diplomatic channels with the speed of something that felt, to many species, less like information and more like an alarm. Species who had negotiated with the Concord for centuries understood every possible response to pressure: agreement, argument, open refusal, followed by posturing, threats, sometimes even limited conflict before a settlement was reached. What they did not understand, what no record in Concord history could explain, was silence offered without anger, a door closed without a single raised voice. Aboard Threnodi's Reach, Vex the Call remained in the chamber long after the other delegates had filed out, murmuring among themselves in a dozen different languages, all of them circling the same unanswerable question. He stood at the edge of the star map, staring at the 3 amber points of light that represented the systems humanity had just refused to discuss further, and found himself unable to predict what would come next for the first time in longer than he cared to admit. Ambassador Kessa remained behind as well, watching the Arbiter with quiet, careful eyes. "You did not expect that," she said finally. "No," Vex the Call admitted. "I did not." "Perhaps," Kessa said, "we should have listened more closely to what they told us yesterday. They said they did not come here to be measured against another species' history. We assumed that was simply a negotiating position. And now?" "Now," Kessa said, "I wonder if it was a warning." Far from the quiet tension of Threnodi's Reach, on a world called New Halden, one of the 3 systems at the heart of the dispute, a woman named Emily Torres stood in the doorway of her home and watched the evening sky, unaware that her entire future had just been decided in a small gray room hundreds of light years away. She had settled on New Halden 11 years earlier, one of the first families to break ground on soil that had never known a human footprint before hers. She had buried a husband there, raised 2 children there, and built a life from nothing but effort and the quiet stubbornness that seemed to run through everyone who chose to live so far from the world humanity called home. She did not know, that evening, that a delegation of strangers had just decided her home was worth defending without compromise. She only knew that the crops were coming in well this season, that her youngest daughter had finally learned to pilot the small transport shuttle without assistance, and that the sky above New Halden, unfamiliar as it had once seemed, now felt entirely like her own. Back aboard the station, the human delegation prepared for departure. Their ship, a modest vessel called the Meridian, waited in the station's outer docking ring, its systems already cycling through pre-launch checks under Grant's careful supervision. Laura sat in the small common area, staring at the star map displayed on her tablet, tracing the path back toward human space with one finger. "They're going to talk about this for a long time," she said quietly. "Probably," Daniel agreed, settling into the seat across from her. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, aware that whatever he said now would likely be repeated back to him many times over the months ahead, in council chambers and public hearings, and quiet conversations just like this one. "I think," he said, "we made the only choice that didn't ask us to become smaller than we are." Grant appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Ship's ready. We can depart whenever you give the word." Daniel nodded and rose from his seat. As he moved toward the docking corridor, he paused for a moment at a narrow viewport overlooking the vast curve of Threnodi's Reach, the station's lights glittering against the black backdrop of space like scattered embers. Somewhere inside that station, 12 species were still trying to understand what had just happened. He wondered, briefly, whether they would ever fully grasp it, or whether humanity's choice would simply become one more mystery added to a long history of first encounters that never went quite as expected. The Meridian departed Threnodi's Reach 3 hours later, slipping quietly away from the station without ceremony, without further communication, without so much as a final message exchanged between the two parties. To the sensors of every ship still docked nearby, it looked like nothing more than a routine departure. To the analysts who would study the moment for weeks afterward, it would come to represent something far larger, the exact instant an entire galaxy lost its ability to predict what humanity might do next. In the days that followed, the Concorde's diplomatic offices filled with quiet, urgent activity. Reports were drafted and redrafted. Historians combed through centuries of first contact records, searching for any precedent that might explain the human delegation's behavior, and found nothing that matched. Every previous species, when faced with the choice between agreement and exclusion, had eventually chosen agreement, understanding that survival among the Concorde's many members depended on cooperation, however uneven the terms. Humanity had chosen neither. They had simply left, calmly, without a single threat exchanged, and vanished back into the quiet dark of their own territory. HFY convened a small private meeting 3 days after the walkout, gathering only his closest advisors within a chamber far smaller than the one where the talks had taken place. The mood was tense, though carefully restrained, each delegate choosing their words with the caution of beings who understood that whatever was decided in this room would shape the Concorde's next steps for years to come. "We must consider the possibility," said a delegate named Oren Vess, an older member of the Concorde's Strategic Council, "that this was a calculated escalation, a prelude to further defiance, perhaps even conflict." "I do not believe that," Kessa said quietly. Their departure showed no signs of preparation for conflict, no weapons displayed, no threats issued. If anything, it showed the opposite, a species choosing restraint over aggression. "Then what was it?" Oren Vess asked. "A species does not simply walk away from negotiations that determine its future without some larger purpose in mind." "Perhaps," HFY said slowly, "the purpose was simpler than we assume. Perhaps they walked away because they had already decided the terms offered were unacceptable, and saw no value in continuing a conversation that would not change that fact." The room fell quiet at this, the weight of the idea settling over each delegate in turn. It was, in its own way, a more unsettling possibility than open conflict would have been. A species that fought back could be understood, managed, eventually reasoned with through strength or negotiation. A species that simply stopped participating, calmly and without explanation, offered no clear path forward at all. "What do we do now?" Kessa asked. HFY was quiet for a long moment, his silver-blue skin shifting slowly through shades of thoughtful gray. "We watch," he said finally, "and we wait to see what they do next, because I suspect that will tell us far more about this species than any words exchanged at that table ever could." Meanwhile, Far across the quiet dark separating Concord territory from human space, the Meridian continued its journey home, carrying within it a decision that would ripple outward for months to come, unnoticed by the crew, who had simply done what they believed was right, and unaware of just how deeply that quiet, deliberate silence would come to unsettle a galaxy that had never before encountered a species willing to walk away without a single word of anger. Aboard the ship, Daniel stood once more at a viewport, watching the stars slide slowly past, and allowed himself, for the first time in days, a single quiet breath of something like relief. Whatever came next, he knew, would not be simple, but it would, at least, be entirely humanity's own choice to make. Weeks passed aboard Threnodi's Reach with no word from human space. No messages arrived on the open channels the Concorde had maintained since first contact. No requests for further talks. No formal statement explaining the walkout, its purpose, or its meaning. The silence stretched on, day after day, until it became its own kind of presence in the Concorde's diplomatic offices, a weight felt by everyone who worked within them, even if none could quite explain why. Vex the Call found himself returning again and again to the same question during long, sleepless stretches in his private quarters. What did a species do when it stopped asking for anything at all? He had spent decades studying the patterns of new arrivals to the Concorde, the careful dance of demands and concessions that eventually settled every relationship into something predictable. Humanity had broken that pattern entirely, and in doing so, had left him with nothing familiar to guide his next decision. Kessa requested access to the Concorde's scout network 3 weeks after the walkout, a request that required approval from the full Strategic Council before it could be granted. She stood before them in a chamber not unlike the one where the original talks had taken place, though smaller, quieter, populated only by the Concorde's most senior military and diplomatic minds. "We need information," Kessa said, "not assumptions. If we continue to guess at humanity's intentions without evidence, we risk making a decision that could damage relations for generations to come, in either direction." Orin Vess, still unconvinced that humanity's silence represented anything but a slow-building threat, argued for a more cautious approach. Scouts near human territory risk provoking exactly the response we hope to avoid. If they detect our presence, they may interpret it as an act of aggression. "They already believe we acted with something close to aggression during the talks," Kessa said. "A single quiet scout mission is unlikely to change that perception significantly. What it will do is give us facts, rather than fear, to work from." After considerable debate, the Council granted limited approval. A small unmanned scout vessel, designed to observe from a careful distance without engaging any of humanity's own sensor networks, was dispatched toward the outer edges of human space, nearly a month after the Meridian's departure from Threnodi's Reach. What the scout observed, over the following 2 weeks, did little to settle the growing unease within Concorde leadership. Human shipyards, several of them newly constructed since the walkout, showed a marked increase in activity. Construction schedules that scout analysts estimated would normally require years were being compressed into months. New vessel designs appeared, larger and more heavily reinforced than anything previously catalogued in humanity's known fleet inventory. Colonial worlds along the edges of human territory, including the 3 systems at the center of the original dispute, showed clear signs of expanded defensive infrastructure, ground-based installations, orbital platforms, and what appeared to be coordinated evacuation planning for civilian populations, though no evacuations had yet taken place. And yet, despite all of this visible activity, the Scouts' most careful analysis found no evidence whatsoever of fleet movement toward Concorde territory, no aggressive posturing along shared borders, no attempt to expand beyond the systems humanity already claimed. Whatever humanity was building toward, it did not appear to be conflict, at least not conflict aimed outward. Kessa presented these findings to the Council personally, standing before the same skeptical faces that had questioned her request weeks earlier. "They are not preparing to attack us," she said. "They are preparing to no longer need us." The room absorbed this in silence for a long moment. "Explain," Vex the Call said quietly. "Every measure we've observed points toward self-sufficiency," Kessa continued. "Expanded shipbuilding, not for offense, but likely for trade and defense entirely independent of Concorde infrastructure. Fortified colonies, prepared to withstand pressure without needing to request assistance from any outside power. If I had to summarize humanity's current trajectory in a single sentence, it would be this. They are building a future in which the Concord's approval or disapproval simply no longer matters to them. Orenvest shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That is, in its own way, more troubling than open conflict would be. Why? Kessa asked. Because conflict can be resolved, Orenvest said. Terms can be negotiated, victories and losses accounted for, peace eventually restored. But a species that simply stops needing us, that builds itself into complete independence and closes its doors quietly behind it, leaves us with nothing to negotiate at all. We become irrelevant to them, and irrelevance is a far harder thing to recover from than defeat. Vex the Call considered this carefully, his silver-blue skin shifting through slow patterns of thought. Around the chamber, he could see similar unease reflected in the postures of nearly every delegate present. Species who had spent centuries assuming their influence over younger arrivals was simply the natural order of things, now confronted with the possibility that one such arrival might choose, quietly and without confrontation, to walk entirely out of their sphere of relevance. News of the scouts' findings spread quickly through certain corners of the Concord, despite efforts to keep the report contained within the Strategic Council. Other species, long accustomed to watching the Concord's dealings with newer arrivals from a cautious distance, began to take notice of humanity's growing independence with interest of their own. A trade envoy from a species called the Halvan, historically rivals to several of the Concord's founding members, approached human territory through informal channels roughly 6 weeks after the walkout, offering preliminary discussions around resource sharing entirely outside the Concord's established framework. The offer was cautious, testing, designed to gauge whether humanity's silence toward the Concord extended to every established power in the region, or whether it represented something more specific to the terms offered at Threnity's reach. Daniel Whitfield, back on Earth and deep in briefings with humanity's governing council, reviewed the Halvan proposal with careful interest. Laura Bennett sat across the table from him, along with several members of the council's Foreign Affairs Committee, all of them studying the offer with the same mixture of curiosity and caution. "They're testing the waters," Laura said, "seeing if we're open to working around the Concord entirely." "Are we?" asked one of the council members, an older woman named Margaret Halloway, who had overseen humanity's foreign policy through most of the past decade. Daniel considered the question carefully. "We're open to fair terms, wherever they come from," he said. The Concord wasn't wrong that partnerships matter. They were wrong about what kind of partnership they thought they could demand from us, without offering anything close to equal terms in return. "So we respond to the Halvan?" Margaret asked. "Carefully," Daniel said. "We don't need to rush into anything. Let them understand we're willing to listen, without giving away more than we understand about their own intentions." We spent 2 days learning exactly how costly it can be to negotiate before understanding the full picture. Grant Ashford, seated near the back of the room, spoke up for the first time in the meeting. "There's something else worth considering. Every day we don't respond publicly to the Concord. Every day we just keep building and keep quiet. Their uncertainty grows." Kessa's assessment, based on what our own intelligence has picked up from the scout encounter, suggests some in the Concord are starting to see our silence as more unsettling than any statement we could make. "You think we should keep saying nothing?" Margaret said. "I think," Grant said, "that for the first time since first contact, we hold something the Concord doesn't have: time, and the quiet to use it however we choose." The council considered this for a long moment. Outside the tall windows of the meeting chamber, the lights of a city humanity had built, long before it ever knew the stars held other minds looking back, stretched out toward a horizon that, for the first time in recorded history, no longer felt quite so limited. Daniel finally spoke, breaking the thoughtful silence that had settled over the room. "Let's keep building," he said. "Let's keep our borders secure, keep our people safe, and let the Concord wonder what comes next. When we're ready to speak again, we'll speak from a position no one in that chamber can question, one way or the other." Margaret nodded slowly, though a trace of concern remained visible in her expression. "And if they interpret our silence as preparation for something worse than independence? If they decide to act first, out of fear, rather than patience?" Daniel had considered this possibility many times since the walkout, turning it over during quiet nights when sleep proved difficult to find. He did not have a certain answer, only the same steady conviction that had guided him through every difficult moment inside that chamber aboard Threnodi's Reach. "Then we'll be ready for that too," he said. "But I don't believe that's what's happening. Fear rarely moves as slowly, or as carefully, as the Concorde has moved since we left that table. I think they're doing exactly what we hoped they would, watching, waiting, and starting, for the first time, to wonder whether they understand us at all." Far above the chamber, where the council continued its careful deliberations, satellites relayed quiet streams of data toward shipyards scattered across a dozen worlds, where new vessels continued to take shape beneath the steady hands of engineers who understood only that their work mattered, without needing to know the full weight of the decisions being made in rooms far above their own. And light years away, aboard Threnodi's Reach, Vex the Call stood once more before the great star map at the center of the empty chamber, where the original talks had taken place, staring at the quiet dark stretching between Concorde space and the borders of a species that had, in the span of a few short weeks, become the single most unpredictable variable he had encountered in his long career of careful, practiced diplomacy. 3 months after the Meridian departed Threnodi's Reach, a single message arrived through the open diplomatic channel the Concorde had maintained since the earliest days of first contact. It was brief, formally worded, and carried none of the anger or accusation many within the Concorde had quietly braced themselves to find. Vex the Call received the message personally, standing alone in his private office, as the words scrolled slowly across the display before him. He read it twice before summoning the Strategic Council to an emergency session, his expression carefully composed, though something behind his eyes suggested the calm required real effort to maintain. The council gathered within the hour, filling the small chamber with a tension that had only grown sharper over the preceding weeks of silence. Kessa took her seat near the front, watching Vex the Call closely as he prepared to address them. "We have received communication from humanity," he said, without preamble. "I will read it to you exactly as it was received." He activated the display, and the message appeared for the full council to see. "The 3 border systems, formerly under dispute, will remain under human administration. This is not open for further negotiation. Humanity remains willing to discuss trade, communication, and cooperative agreements with the Concorde, provided such discussions proceed on terms that recognize humanity as an equal partner, rather than a species to be measured against precedent it did not agree to. Further discussion may resume whenever the Concorde is prepared to negotiate on that basis." The chamber remained silent for a long moment after the message finished displaying. No elaboration followed. No list of demands, no threat of consequence should the Concorde refuse, no lengthy explanation of humanity's reasoning, just a simple, direct statement, delivered without a single wasted word. Oren Vess was the first to break the silence. "That is all? No further terms? No timeline for response?" "That is all," Vex the Call confirmed. "It is almost insulting in its brevity," Oren Vess said, though something in his tone suggested the sentiment ran deeper than mere irritation. "Perhaps," Kessa said quietly. "That is precisely the point. They spent 2 days in that chamber, listening to us wrap every demand in careful language, precedent, and concern for their own safety. This message contains none of that. I believe they are showing us, deliberately, the difference between how they choose to communicate and how we chose to communicate with them." Vex the Call studied the message once more, turning the ambassador's words over in his mind. 2 days of careful diplomatic maneuvering, weeks of anxious deliberation over scout reports and strategic assessments, months of uncertainty that had consumed the attention of the Concorde's most experienced minds, and it had all led here, to a message shorter than the opening greeting he had once offered at the start of the original talks. "What do we do?" a younger delegate asked from near the back of the chamber, her voice uncertain in a way that reflected the mood of nearly everyone present. "We consider what this message tells us," Vex the Call said slowly, "about the species we so recently believed we understood." He rose from his seat and moved toward the same wide viewport where he had once stood, in the earliest days following the walkout, staring at the quiet dark separating Concorde space from human territory. The scout reports Kessa had gathered weeks earlier remained fresh in his memory, the steady, patient construction of shipyards and defenses, the careful, deliberate expansion of a species preparing not for conquest, but for complete self-reliance. "We spent months," he said, "trying to determine what humanity wanted from us. We built entire strategies around the assumption that their silence was a form of leverage, a tool used to extract better terms, once talks eventually resumed. I believe now that we misunderstood the situation entirely." "How so?" Kessa asked. "I believe," HFY said, "that humanity was never negotiating with us at all. Not truly. Not after that second day. I believe they made their decision the moment they stood from that table, and everything since, the silence, the shipbuilding, the fortification of their worlds, was simply humanity preparing for a future that did not require our approval, regardless of what we chose to do next." The chamber absorbed this in heavy silence. Around the room, delegates who had spent centuries assuming their influence over younger species was simply the natural order of galactic life, found themselves confronting a possibility few of them had ever needed to consider before. A species entirely capable of thriving without them, choosing partnership on its own terms, or no partnership at all. "Then the question," Kessa said finally, "is not what humanity wants from us. The question is, what we are willing to offer. Now that we understand, they do not need us nearly as much as we once assumed." HFY turned from the viewport to face the assembled council, his expression settling into something more resolved than it had been in months. "Then let us answer that question honestly, for the first time since this began." The Concord's formal response took nearly 2 weeks to draft, passing through committee after committee, each delegate offering revisions shaped by centuries of careful diplomatic habit. When it finally arrived in human space, delivered through the same open channel humanity's own message had used, it carried a tone markedly different from anything spoken during the original talks aboard Threnodi's Reach. Daniel Whitfield read the response in the same council chamber where he had once debated the Halvan proposal with Margaret Halloway and the rest of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Laura Bennett sat beside him, and Grant Ashford stood near the window, watching the city lights below with the same quiet patience he had carried through every difficult moment of the past several months. The Concord acknowledges humanity's continued administration of the 3 systems previously in dispute. We recognize that our initial approach to these talks did not adequately account for humanity's position as a sovereign and capable species, rather than a new arrival requiring guidance drawn from precedent it did not choose. We remain open to further discussion, on terms that reflect equal partnership, whenever humanity is prepared to resume dialogue. Daniel read the message twice, much as HFY had done on the receiving end weeks earlier, and found himself feeling something he had not expected after months of careful, deliberate silence. Not triumph exactly, something quieter, and in its own way, more significant. "They're offering to start over," Laura said, reading the message over his shoulder. "They're offering to start over as equals," Daniel corrected gently. "That's different from where we began." Margaret Halloway studied the message with the careful eye of someone who had spent decades reading between the lines of diplomatic language. "It's a genuine shift," she said. "Whatever else changed over these past months, I don't believe this message was written by the same council that sat across from you at that table." "No," Daniel agreed. "I don't believe it was either." Grant finally turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "So what happens now?" Daniel considered the question carefully, thinking back to the small gray room aboard Threnodi's Reach, where the 3 of them had first decided to walk away from a conversation that had never truly offered them fair terms. He thought of Emily Torres and her daughters on New Halden, of the countless families across 3 systems who had continued building their lives without ever knowing how close those lives had come to being placed under the careful, distant administration of a Concord Council light years away. He thought of the shipyards humanity had spent months quietly expanding, not out of aggression, but out of the simple, steady determination to never again find itself dependent on the goodwill of strangers who measured humanity's worth against a history it had never been part of. "Now," Daniel said, "we decide, on our own terms, whether a second conversation is worth having." The council chamber fell into thoughtful silence, each member weighing the question in their own way. Outside, the city continued its quiet evening rhythms, entirely unaware of the careful, deliberate choice being made within these walls, a choice that would shape humanity's place among the stars for generations to come. Weeks later, A new human delegation departed for Threnity's Reach, smaller than the first, carrying with it none of the uncertainty that had marked the original journey. Daniel led the delegation once more, though this time, he understood exactly what awaited him at the other end of the journey, and exactly what humanity was, and was not, willing to accept. When the delegation arrived, Vex the Call greeted them personally at the docking bay, a gesture of respect that had not been extended during the original talks. His silver-blue skin shifted through calm, steady tones as he welcomed the humans aboard the station once more. "Ambassador Whitfield," he said, "thank you for returning." "Thank you for the invitation," Daniel replied, offered, this time, on terms worth accepting. The two of them walked together toward the same circular chamber where the original talks had taken place, though the atmosphere within it felt entirely different now, charged not with careful testing and hidden agendas, but with the quiet possibility of a partnership built correctly this time, from the very beginning. As the new round of talks began, delegates from across the Concord watched with an interest that had shifted, in the months since the original walkout, from cautious curiosity into something closer to genuine respect. Whatever else had changed in the galaxy over the past several months, one truth had settled firmly into place among species who had spent centuries assuming they understood exactly how new arrivals ought to behave. Humanity had walked away from a table where the terms were unfair, and in doing so, had shown an entire galaxy of far older civilizations, something none of them had expected to learn from the newest species among them. That some kinds of strength were not measured in fleets, or borders, or centuries of accumulated influence, but in the simple, steady willingness to say no, and to mean it, regardless of what anyone else believed the consequences might be. And somewhere far beyond the quiet chamber where a new chapter of careful, equal negotiation had just begun, on a world called New Halden, Emily Torres watched her daughters run laughing through fields of crops grown from soil that would remain, now and always, entirely their own.